Chapter 29, The Triumph of the Right. 1. Introduction. Speaking to Detroit auto workers in October 1980, Republican presidential candidate Ronald Reagan described what he saw as the American dream under Democratic President Jimmy Carter. The family garage may have still held 2 cars, cracked Reagan, but they were both Japanese and they're out of gas. The charismatic former governor of California suggested that a once proud nation was running on empty. But Reagan held out hope for redemption. Stressing the theme of national decline, he nevertheless promised to make the United States once again a glorious city upon a hill. In November, Reagan's vision triumphed. Reagan rode the wave of a powerful political movement referred to by historians as the New Right. More libertarian in its economics and more politically forceful in its conservative religious principles than the moderate brand of conservatism popular after World War II, the New Right had by the 1980s evolved into the most influential wing of the Republican Party, and it could claim increasing credit for Republican electoral successes. Building on the gradual unraveling of the New Deal political order in the 1960s and 70s, the conservative movement not only enjoyed the guidance of skilled politicians like Reagan, but drew tremendous energy from a broad range of grassroots activists. Countless ordinary citizens, newly mobilized Christian conservatives in particular, helped the Republican Party steer the country rightward. Enduring conflicts over race, political or economic policy, sexual politics, and foreign affairs fatally fractured the liberal consensus that had dominated American politics since the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, and the New Right attracted support from Reagan Democrats, blue-collar voters who had lost faith in the old liberal creed. The rise of the right affected Americans' everyday lives in numerous ways. The Reagan's administration's embrace of free markets dispensed with the principles of active income redistribution and social welfare spending that had animated the New Deal and Great Society in the 1930s and 60s. As American liberals increasingly embraced a rights framework directed towards African Americans, Latinos, women, lesbians, and gays, and other marginalized groups, conservative policymakers targeted the regulatory and legal landscape of the United States. Critics complained that Reagan's policies served the interests of corporations and wealthy individuals and pointed to the sudden widening of economic inequality. But the New Right harnessed popular distrust of regulation, taxes, and bureaucrats, and the conservative activists celebrated the end of hyperinflation and substantial growth in GDP. In many ways, however, the rise of the right promised more than it delivered. Battered but intact, the social welfare programs of the New Deal and Great Society, for example, Social Security, Medicaid, aid to families with dependent children, survived the 1980s. Despite Republican vows of fiscal discipline, both the federal government and national debt ballooned. At the end of the decade, conservative Christians viewed popular culture as more vulgar and hostile to their values than ever before. And in the near term, the New Right registered only partial victories on a range of public policies and cultural issues. Yet from a long-term perspective, conservatives achieved a subtler and more enduring transformation of American politics and society. In the words of one historian, the conservative movement successfully changed the terms of debate and placed its opponents on the defensive. Liberals in their program and policies did not disappear, but they increasingly fought battles on terrain chosen by the New Right. One moment. 2. Conservative ascendance. The Reagan Revolution marked the culmination of a long process of political mobilization on the American right. In its first 2 decades after World War II, the New Deal seemed firmly embedded in American electoral politics as public policy. Even 2-term Republican President Dwight D. Eisenhower declined to roll back the welfare state. To be sure, William F. Buckley tapped into a deep vein of elite conservatism in 1955 by announcing the first issue of National Review that his magazine stands athwart history yelling stop. Senator Joseph McCarthy and John Birch Society founder Robert Welch stirred anti-communist fervor. But in general, the right lacked organizational cohesion. Following Lyndon Johnson's resounding defeat of Republican Barry Goldwater, Mr. Conservative. In the 1964 presidential election, many observers declared American conservatism finished. New York Times columnist Jane Redston wrote that Goldwater had wrecked his party for a long time to come. Despite these dire predictions, conservatism not only persisted, it prospered. Its growing appeal had several causes. The expansive social and economic agenda of Johnson's Great Society reminded anti-communists of Soviet-style central planning, and deficits alarmed fiscal conservatives. Race also drove the creation of the new right. The Civil Rights Movement, along with the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, challenged the racial hierarchy of the Jim Crow South. All of these occurred under Democratic leadership, pushing white Southerners toward the Republican Party. In the late 1960s and early 70s, Black Power, affirmative action, and court-ordered busing of children between schools to achieve racial balance brought white backlash in the North, often in cities previously known for political liberalism. To many white Americans, the urban rebellions, anti-war protests, and student uprisings of the late 1960s signaled social chaos. At the same time, soaring wage growth, rising prices, and growing tax burdens threatened many working class and middle class citizens who longed formed the core of the New Deal coalition. Liberalism no longer seemed to offer the great mass of white Americans a road trip map to prosperity, so they reached for new political solutions. Former Alabama governor and conservative Democrat George Wallace masterfully exploited the racial, cultural, and economic resentments of working-class whites during his presidential runs in 1968 and 1972. Wallace's record as a staunch segregationist made him the hero in the Deep South, where he won 5 states as a third-party candidate in the 1968 general election. Wallace's populist message also resonated with blue-collar workers in the industrial North who felt left behind by the right's evolution. On the campaign stump, the fiery candidate lambasted hippies, anti-war protesters, and government bureaucrats. He assailed female welfare recipients for breeding children as a cash crop and ridiculed overeducated ivory tower intellectuals who don't know how to park a bicycle straight. Wallace also advanced progressive proposals for federal job training programs, a minimum wage hike, and legal protection for collective bargaining. Running as a Democrat in 72, Wallace captured the Michigan primary and pulled second in the industrial heartland of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. In May 72, an assassin's bullet left Wallace paralyzed and ended his campaign. Nevertheless, his amalgamation of New Deal-style proposals and conservative populism represented the rapid reordering of party loyalties in the late 60s and early 70s. Richard Nixon similarly harnessed the new right sense of grievance through his rhetoric about law and order and the silent majority. But Nixon and his Republican successor, Gerald Ford, continued to accommodate the politics of the New Deal order. The new right remained without a major public champion. Christian conservatives also felt themselves under siege from liberalism. In the early 60s, the Supreme Court decisions prohibiting teacher-led prayer, Engel versus Patel, and Bible reading in public schools, Abelington versus Schmelp, led some on the right to conclude that a liberal justice system threatened Christian values. In the following years, the counterculture celebration of sex and drugs, along with relaxed obscenity and pornography laws, intensified the conviction that permissive liberalism encouraged morality in private life. Evangelical Protestants, Christians who professed a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, upheld the Bible as an infallible source of truth and felt a duty to convert or evangelize non-believers, composed the core of the so-called religious right. With increasing assertiveness in the 1960s and 70s, Christian conservatives mobilized to protect the traditional family. Women composed a striking number of the religious rights foot soldiers. In 68 and 69, a group of newly politicized mothers in Anaheim, California, led a sustained protest against sex education in public schools. Catholic activist Phyllis Schlafly marshaled opposition to the ERA, while evangelical pop singer Anita Bryant drew national headlines for her successful fight to repeal Miami's gay rights ordinance in 1977. In 1979, Beverly LaHelle, whose husband Tim, an evangelical pastor in San Diego, later authored the wildly popular Left Behind Christian book series, founded Concerned Women for America, which linked small groups of local activists opposed to the ERA, abortion, homosexuality, and no-fault divorce. Activists like Shafay and Lahale valorized motherhood as women's highest calling. Abortion therefore struck at the core of their female identity. Perhaps more than any other issue, abortion drew different segments of the religious right, Catholics and Protestants, men and women, together. The Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling outraged many devout Catholics and evangelicals, who had been less universally opposed to the procedure than their Catholic counterparts. Christian author Francis Schaeffer cultivated evangelical opposition to abortion through the 1979 documentary Whatever Happened to the Human Race, arguing that the fate of the unborn is the fate of the human race. With abortion framed in stark existential terms, many evangelicals felt compelled to combat the procedure through political action. One moment. Grassroots passion drove anti-abortion activism, but a set of religious and secular institutions turned the various strands of the new right into a sophisticated movement. In 1979, Jerry Falwell, a Baptist minister and religious broadcaster from Lynchburg, Virginia, founded the Moral Majority, an explicitly political organization dedicated to advancing a pro-life, pro-family, pro-morality, and pro-American agenda. The Moral Majority skillfully wove together social and economic appeals to make itself a force in Republican politics. Secular, business-oriented institutions also joined the attack on liberalism, fueled by stagflation and the federal government's creation of new regulatory agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Conservative business leaders bankrolled new think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the Cato Institute. These organizations provided grassroots activists with ready-made policy prescriptions. Other business leaders took a more direct approach by hiring Washington lobbyists and creating political action committees, PACs, to press their agendas in the halls of Congress and federal agencies. Between 76 and 80, the number of corporate PACs rose from under 300 to over 12,000. Grassroots activists and business leaders received unlikely support from a circle of neoconservatives, disillusioned intellectuals who had rejected liberalism and the left to become Republicans. Irving Kristol, a former Marxist who went on to champion free market capitalism as a Wall Street Journal columnist, defined a neoconservative as a liberal who has been mugged by reality. Neoconservative journals like Commentary and Public Interest argued that the Great Society had proven counterproductive, perpetuating the poverty and racial segregation that it aimed to cure. By the middle of the 1970s, neoconservatives felt mugged by foreign affairs as well. As ardent Cold Warriors, they argued that Nixon's policy of détente left the United States vulnerable to the Soviet Union. In sum, several streams of conservative mobilization converged in the late 70s. Each wing of the burgeoning New Right disaffected northern blue-collar workers, white Southerners, evangelicals, devout Catholics, and business leaders, disillusioned intellectuals, and Cold War hawks turned to the Republican Party as the most effective vehicle for their political counterassault on liberalism and the New Deal political order. After years of mobilization, the domestic and foreign policy catastrophes of the Carter administration proved the headwinds that brought the conservative movement to shore. Three, the conservatism of the Carter years. The election of Jimmy Carter in 1976 brought a Democrat to the White House for the first time since 1969. Large Democratic majorities in Congress provided the new president with an opportunity to move aggressively on the legislative front. But in the infighting in the early 70s behind them, many Democrats hoped the Carter administration would update and expand the New Deal. But Carter won the presidency on a wave of post-Watergate disillusionment with government that did not translate into a support for liberal ideas. In its early days, the Carter administration embraced several policies backed by liberals. It pushed an economic stimulus package containing $4 billion in public works, extended food stamps benefits to 2.5 million new recipients, enlarged the earned income tax credit for low-income households, and expanded the Nixon-era Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. But while the White House quickly realized that Democratic control of Congress did not guarantee support for its initially left-leaning economic proposals, many of the Democrats elected to Congress in the aftermath of Watergate were more moderate than their predecessors, who had been trained in the New Deal gospel. The conservative Democrats sometimes partnered with congressional Republicans to oppose Carter, most notably in response to the administration's proposal for a federal office of consumer protection. Events outside Carter's control certainly helped discredit liberalism, but the president's own temperament and philosophical conservatism hamstrung the administration and pushed national politics further to the right. In his 1978 State of the Union address, Carter lectured Americans that government cannot solve our problems. It cannot eliminate poverty or provide bountiful economy or reduce inflation or save our cities or cure illiteracy or provide energy. The statement neatly captured the ideological transformation of the country. Rather than leading a resurgence of American liberalism, Carter became, as one historian put it, the first president to govern a post-New Deal framework. Organized later felt abandoned by Carter, who remained cool to several of their highest legislative priorities. The president offered tepid support for a national health insurance proposal and declined to lobby aggressively for a package of modest labor law reforms. The business community rallied to defeat the later measure in what ALFCO chief George Meany described as an attack by every anti-union group in America to kill the labor movement. In 1977 and 78, liberal Democrats rallied behind Humphrey Hawkins' Full Employment and Trading Act, which promised to end unemployment through extensive government planning. The bill not only aimed to guarantee a job to every American, but also to reunite the interracial working-class Democratic coalition that had been fractured by deindustrialization and affirmative action. But Carter's lack of enthusiasm for the proposal allowed conservatives from both parties to water down the bill to a purely symbolic gesture. Liberals, like labor leaders, came to regard the president as an unreliable ally. Carter also came under fire from Republicans, especially the religious right. His administration incurred the wrath of the evangelicals in 1978 when the IRS established new rules for revoking the tax-exempt status of racially segregated private Christian schools. The rules only strengthened a policy instituted by the Nixon administration. However, the religious right accused Carter of singling out Christian institutions. Republican activist Richard Viguier described the IRS controversy as the spark that ignited the religious right's involvement in real politics. Race sat just below the surface of the IRS fight. After all, many of the schools have been founded to circumvent court-ordered desegregation, but the IRS ruling allowed the new right to rain down fire on big government interference while downplaying the practice of segregation at the heart of the cause. When the IRS controversy flared, economic crisis multiplied. Unemployment reached 7.8% in May 1980, up from 6% at the start of Carter's first term. Inflation, the rate at which the cost of goods and services increases, jumped from 6% in 78 to a staggering 20% by the winter of 1980. In another bad omen, the iconic Chrysler Corporation appeared to close to bankruptcy. The administration responded to these challenges in fundamentally conservative ways. First, Carter proposed a tax cut for the upper middle class, which Congress passed in 1978. Secondly, the White House embraced the long-term goal of the conservative movement by deregulating the airline and trucking industries in 78 and 80, respectively. Third, Carter proposed balancing the federal budget, much to the dismay of liberals who would have preferred to use that deficit spending to finance a new New Deal. Finally, to halt inflation, Carter appointed the chair of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, raised interest rates and tightened the money supply, policies designed to reduce inflation in the long run, but which increased unemployment in the short run. Liberalism was on the run. The decade's second energy crisis, which witnessed another spike in oil prices and oil shortages across the country, brought out the Southern Baptist moralist in Carter. On July 15, 1979, the president delivered a nationally televised speech on energy policy in which he attributed the country's economic woes to a crisis of confidence. Carter lamented that too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. The country initially responded favorably to the push for energy conservation, yet Carter's emphasis on discipline and sacrifice and his spiritual diagnosis for economic hardship, sidestepped the deeper questions of large-scale economic change, and downplayed the harsh toll inflation had taken on regular Americans. Four, the election of 1980. These domestic challenges, combined with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the hostage crisis in Iran, hobbled Carter, leading into his 1980 re-election campaign. Many Democrats were dismayed by his policies. The president of the International Association of Mechanics dismissed Carter as the best Republican president since Herbert Hoover. Angered by the White House's refusal to back national health insurance, Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy challenged Carter in the Democratic primaries. Running as the party's liberal standard-bearer and heir to the legacy of his slain older brothers, Kennedy garnered support from key labor unions and left-wing Democrats. Carter ultimately vanquished Kennedy, but the close primary tally exposed the president's vulnerability. Carter's opposition in the general election was Ronald Reagan, a former Hollywood actor who had served 2 terms as governor of California. Reagan ran as a staunch fiscal conservative and Cold War hawk, vowing to reduce government spending and shrink federal bureaucracy. Reagan also accused his opponent of failing to confront the Soviet Union and vowed steep increases in military spending. Carter responded by calling Reagan a warmonger, but the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the confinement of 52 American hostages in Iran discredited Carter's foreign policy in the eyes of many Americans. The incumbent fared no better on domestic affairs. Unemployment remained nearly at 8%. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve's anti-inflation measures pushed interest rates to an unheard of 18.5%. Reagan seized on these bad economic trends. On the campaign trail, he brought down the House by proclaiming a recession is when your neighbor loses his job, a depression is when you lose your job. Reagan would then pause by concluding, and a recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his job. Social and cultural issues presented yet another challenge for the president. Although a self-proclaimed born-again Christian and Sunday school teacher, Carter struggled to court the religious right. Carter scandalized devout Christians by admitting to lustful thoughts during an interview with Playboy in 1976, telling the reporter he had committed adultery in his heart many times. Though Reagan was only a nominal Christian and rarely attended church, the religious right embraced him. Reverend Jimmy Fowle directed the full weight of his moral majority behind Reagan. The organization registered an estimated 2 million new voters in 1980. Reagan also cultivated the religious right by denouncing abortion and endorsing prayer in school. The IRS tax exemption issue resurfaced as well, with 1980 Republican platform vowing to halt the unconstitutional regulatory vendetta launched by Mr. Carter's IRS commission against independent schools. Early in the primary season, Reagan condemned the policy during a speech at South Carolina's Bob Jones University, which had recently sued the IRS after the school's ban on interracial dating led to the loss of its tax-exempt status. Reagan's campaign appealed subtly but unmistakably to the racial hostilities of white voters. The candidate held his first post-nominating convention rally at the Neshoba County Fair near Philadelphia, Mississippi, the town where 3 civil rights workers had been murdered in 1964. In his speech, Reagan championed the doctrine of states' rights, which had been the rallying cry of segregationists in the 50s and 60s. In criticizing the welfare state, Reagan had long employed the thinly veiled racial stereotypes about a welfare queen in Chicago who drove a Cadillac while defrauding the government or a strapping young buck purchasing T-bone steaks with food stamps. Like George Wallace before him, Reagan exploited the racial and cultural resentments of a struggling white working-class voters. And like Wallace, he attracted blue-collar workers in droves. With the wind at his back on almost every issue, Reagan only needed to blunt Carter's characterization of him as an angry extremist. Reagan did so during their only debate by appearing calm and amiable. "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" he asked the American people at the conclusion of the debate. The American people answered no. Reagan won the election with a 51% of the popular vote to Carter's 41%. Independent John Anderson captured 7%. Despite capturing only a slim majority, Reagan secured a decisive 489 to 449 victory in the Electoral College. Republicans gained control of the Senate for the first time since 1955 by winning 12 seats. Liberal Democrats George McGovern, Frank Church, and Birch Mann went down in defeat, as did liberal Republican Jacob Javits. The GOP picked up 33 House seats, narrowing the Democratic advantage in the lower chamber. The new right had arrived in Washington, D.C. 5. The new right in power. In his first inaugural address, Reagan proclaimed the government is not the solution to the problem, the government is the problem. In reality, Reagan focused less on eliminating government than on redirecting government to serve new ends. In line with that goal, his administration employed a supply-style economic theories that had recently gained popularity among the new right. While the post-war gospel of Keynesian economics had focused on stimulating consumer demand, supply-side economics that held lower personal and corporate tax rates would encourage greater private investment in production. Supply-side advocates promised that the resulting wealth would reach or trickle down to, in the words of critics, lower income groups through job creation and federal and higher wages. Conservative economics Arthur Laffer predicted that lower taxes should generate so much economic activity that the federal tax revenues would actually increase. The administration touted the so-called Laffer curve as its justification for the tax cut that served as the cornerstone of Reagan's first year in office. Republican Congressman Jack Kemp, an early supply-side advocate and co-sponsor of Reagan's tax bill, promised it would unleash creative genius that would invigorate America.